I have Professor Ananad Mavalankar, who is a retired professor at the Department of Political Science at MS University, Vadodara. His areas of interest: international relations, Indian government and politics, and comparative politics. He is also a friend of the center. I now invite him to introduce the Religious Demography book.
Esteemed dignitaries on the dais and friends, thank you, Professor Lobo, for giving me this opportunity to introduce a very fascinating book on religions, democracy of India, myths and realities. When we are so much bombarded by Hindutva ideology and some fears that some of us have about prevalence or predominance of certain minority communities might be taking over, some fears that which are misplaced, some of the myths that are going around, I think it's very topical that Professor Lobo and Jayesh Bhai have given us this particular volume based on a workshop, national seminar on the religious democracy of India. H.K. Doa's foreword of the book: pluralism is India's strength, let us not prettily rise. He has touched the right point, pluralism, but I wish he had connected it with the whole debate on religious democracy. Because the moment we talk about pluralism and we want to continue to maintain a plural polity, plural political system in our country, we have to counter that thing that a certain way of presentation by certain political parties, certain groups in India today, that India belongs to one dominant religion. So given this, I thought that introductory chapter on Jayesh Bhai and Nancy Lobo is interesting because it provides us a good insight on the differential growth rates of religious communities and what are the stakeholders' view on it. Actually, this particular volume is topical because it gives us some insight into the dynamics of religious demography in the context of prevailing myths and realities about this kind of fear that we have. The basic idea being of the religious demography have to do with the whole idea of religion and fertility debate, that whole question. Secondly, there is the whole idea that is presently being projected, and that is that this whole thing is of so-called nationalism debate, and that has been inspired by census data that we have. In this connection, I think Leela Visaria's article is a good one because it dispels certain myths, and she calls that the population growth differential between Hindus and Muslims. She tries to give a good data on the rather broad trend of demography of religious groups in India, and from 1951 to 1971. Based on very solid evidence. And she says that even if the differentials in the rate of growth of Hindus and Muslims persist, India will not become a Muslim majority nation for centuries to come. Further, the differential observed so far are most unlikely to continue in the future. Basically, Leela Visaria also talks about in the context of socio-economic characteristics and the geographical location of religious communities in Indian states to show that these changes are far more important in influencing the fertility behavior rather than the religion per se. Basically, her point is that there is a convergence in the levels of fertility among the different religious communities. Of course, she has given different explanations on differential rates of population, where she talks about factors such as fertility levels, contraceptive use explaining fertility differentials, socio-economic factors explaining fertility differentials. But she cautions us against considering Muslim community as one monolithic group. One interesting point she mentions, and something which we should take note of, is that Muslims emulate the behavior of dominant group in India. They speak different languages, their characteristics of subgroups of Muslim and how subgroups are responding to changes in the country at large, and how they are showing flexibility in relating to organizing their lives. R.B. Bhagat's essay in the book on transition in Hindu and Muslim population growth rates, myths and realities, basically refers to 1901 census, which revealed a decline in the growth rate of Hindu population. Since then, there has been this fear that somehow the Hindu population is going down. That kind of theory that will be propagated by certain groups, that demographic theory of Hindus, as related to Hindus are dying race, that kind of theory. Now, and that there is some kind of higher fertility among Muslims, essential, and that is essentially rooted in Islam. So this point that he dispels quite vigorously. That Islam is not against family planning, and polygamy is not necessarily lead to higher fertility among Muslims. Population stabilization is inevitable in the Muslim community as evidenced from the decline in population growth. Population growth transitions among Muslims, which started in the 1980s compared with Hindus in the 1970s. As the demographic transition is fundamentally linked to the processes of development and modernization, particularly through the roots of expansion of education and rising urbanization, socio-economic differentials among religious groups are very important to understand the relative population growth of different community among them. We have to understand here, Bhagat makes a very important point, that there are regional variations in Muslim population growth. In other words, Muslims is not a homogeneous group. And so we have to understand the demographic behavior of Muslims in different regions of India. Of course, here the important point that we have to keep in mind is that what he is saying, Bhagat's point, is that India's demographic thing is far more regional. India's demographic reality is far more regional than religious. Regional variations are very important. That determines their behavior, particularly their in population, the whole dynamics, rather than the religious question. So I think this is an important point that he makes. And here, one point that I want to mention, and that is that often we wonder whether religious demography as such is a good idea, because it's a colonial concept, colonial legacy that we are still stuck with. But the question is that, does it help? Well, it can help, provided the government is serious in acknowledging that yes, there are certain differences among religious communities, especially among minority communities, and there is required for government funds to reach. So for equitable distribution of government funds, this is required. Such a committee report also talks about this whole question. And I think this is something that we cannot deny the utility of religious demography. Another important theme in the book is that related to religious-based identity politics. Religion being the marker of identity. And the question then is whether that is really creating problems for our democracy. Basically, there is a fallacy here because there is an underlying assumption that this religious identity exists or should exist as a uniform and homogeneous religious community for enabling better governance in the country versus religious community which is divided among ethnic and other lines. V. Sebastian essay talks about the whole religion as again a marker of identity and using it as a taxonomy of religion as a colonial invention, as a given fact. Basically, Sebastian essay tries to discuss dynamics which made religion as a central category in the identity politics and the role played by the census in its notion of majority and minority. Here the problem is, of course, the question of how do you classify religious communities. So there is a whole question of principle of classifying them. There is a debate on it, for which I am afraid there was not that much attention, maybe because of not availability of those kind of papers on that particular issue, and the criteria on which we will try to do that. Ambrose Pinto essay on demography, minorities and communalism talks about the more qualitative aspects of democracy. And I think it is this particular qualitative aspects of democracy is something that is a good critique of the existing discussion on which focus purely on quantitative aspects. So the idea being that you have to look at underlying socio-economic characteristics. There is a decline, there is a whole idea of this Hindu idea of narrative on population. There is a whole question that is being given, and as per the census in 2001, Muslims are now 14.2% of the total population, a rise of 0.8% in the last decade, while Hindus have dropped to 79.8% of the total population, which is fall of 0.7%. It is correct that the rate of growth among Muslims has been 24.6% and the same has been 16.8% among Hindus. But there is and the important point to understand here is that there is a declining trend in the growth rate of the Muslims over the last 3 decades, and that it is sharper than the Hindu community. This has been demonstrated in the demographic studies. The rate of growth among Muslim population has been falling constantly over the last 3 decades, from 34.5% in 1991 to 29.5% in 2001, and now 24.6% in 2011 census. Now 2.4 crores more Muslims since the last decade, and 13.9 crore more Hindus. So basically what they are saying is that percentage, if you look at the actual number, the Hindus have grown more than the Muslims, actually. Although the percentage wise is tells a different story. So he counters the claim that Muslims will soon overtake Hindus in India. He said that is not correct. This is a very important point that is being made. Point that we have to keep in mind here, however, is that this whole characterizing different religious communities purely on the basis of their stated thing on where they belong, the religion. They should not, however, they are not referring to among Hindus, for example, there are different castes and subgroups. There are different marginalized communities within the Hindu fold. These are not being taken into account. Similarly, Muslims and Christians, they are not homogeneous groups. They have also sub-communities, subgroups, and these have to be taken into account. And as far as the Muslims and Christian communities are concerned, the growth rate among them, education and social status are more critical. Education and social status are more critical than religion. Basically, we have to still raise the question whether do we still need a religious census? Because this whole question of no, we have to keep in mind. And here I would also want to say that this particular studies and this kind of demographic studies are of course important. But when we talk about religious communities, we have still not discussed or we have not really figured out religion as a category. One. And secondly, we have to look at sociology of each religious community. So not sociology of religion and sociology of religious community. Both. So these kind of questions, I think if we try to give, then we will give a much more comprehensive and nuanced understanding of the whole idea. Professor Bandukwala has contributed essay there on Muslim demography and democracy. He ended his essay by hoping for and then wishing that